And we are live. What's good, everyone? You're watching Hard Targets, open source intel by the people for the people, news from a multipolar world. This is Teray. It's been a long weekend of absent streams, just getting some time to accumulate some stories over the weekend and get more perspective on this East Palestine train crash in Ohio, and obviously to get more details on it. The media hasn't been covering it that much, and since that event last Wednesday, there have been other notable notable crashes. Specifically, a truck crashing in Arizona of a chemical, I wouldn't call it a spill, but a quarantine zone. So I want to talk a little bit about the implications of this before we get into that. Uh, the usual necessities. Make sure to follow my channel here on YouTube. Also, make sure to follow me on Telegram. You never know when you're going to get kicked off of YouTube and Twitter, so you should follow my Telegram at Hard Targets Intel, and you can just follow my personal Twitter account at Iron Sun USA. I'm going to put that down here below. But it's important to continue the conversation about the implications of these disastrous events, since the federal government would rather talk about UFOs. So, what happened the last week in the events of the train crash? Well, a 50-car derailment had happened in East Palestine, which is a community in Ohio, and 10 of the cars contained a toxic chemical called vinyl chloride. And vinyl chloride is a substance that is only liquid in sub-zero freezing temperatures. Otherwise, at room temperature, it immediately turns to gas. It immediately turns to vapor. So it's highly explosive, highly toxic. It is characterized as both highly flammable, explosive because of how rapidly it turns into gas, and highly carcinogenic. And both of those characteristics are important when we talk about the event, because the images coming out of East Palestine were all of, I'm sure you remember them, this giant black column of smoke rising from the heap of steel that was piled up all over the grounds where the trains had derailed. And this is important for a number of reasons. A, because that is a very provocative image. B, because in the popular mind, the idea of a fire naturally evokes an escalation of disaster. That a fire means that these chemicals that were on the train are now being dispersed into the air, and there's some. After digging around on Telegram, there are people who are pointing out that part of this lack of media coverage or focused media coverage, specifically on East Palestine train derailment, like vinyl chloride, the toxic clouds headed all across the country. The reason this is dangerous is because in and of itself creates a panic that is scientifically not founded. And this image of a big black cloud is sort of a godsend for these deindustrialization, these Green New Deal type green fascists, because it is so striking, it's so alarming to see and to think that, oh man, these tons and tons of this toxic chemical is entering the air. But let me share my screen here to yeah. just to give some of the coverage that was coming out of the quality of what it was, and then I will go into how it's dangerous, because what the real threats are of this event. Because I do believe that the real implications of this crash are the far worse implications are economic and legal to come, and not necessarily any sort of like chemical apocalypse. Yeah, so here is the sparse media coverage that came out. It never really talked about the company behind the train crash or the events that led up to the train crash, like why it happened. Simply and again, the pornographic fixation on the burning of the cargo, and that's important. Um, because if you can fixate on the most striking visual of the event, of the disaster, then you can sweep under the rug all of the long-term implications after, after after the residents are no longer in any chemical danger, after the news moves on to the next thing. We're left with this lingering economic and legal precedent that this disaster sets, which this panic about, oh, we're all going to get cancer and die from the toxic fumes, that aids in this process. But just to tell you what I mean, here is what the sparse coverage looked like. Days after crews released and burned toxic chemicals transported by a wreckage train in Ohio, residents remain concerned about toxic substances that could be lingering in their evacuated neighborhoods. This already is interesting because I mean, when I saw the images first circulating on Twitter, and for days afterward, I assumed that the fire had been caused because of the crash. That I didn't realize that it was part of the controlled response to the crash. Like that's already news to me that it was a controlled burn. Yeah, so about 50 cars, including 10 carrying hazardous materials, specifically vinyl chloride. They had derailed, and the crews ignited the cargo to get rid of the highly flammable toxic chemicals in a controlled environment, creating a dark plume of smoke. Interestingly, people are, especially on TikTok, and are pointing out that there's no response from FEMA, there's no response from the EPA, there's no response from Norfolk Southern, the company that owned the train, and like the people who had to do a controlled burn of the cargo were the people who were operating the train. The crew had to ignite this cargo, which is interesting to say the least. This is one more responsibility put on train engineers and the crew who operate this heavy machinery and work in the transportation sector. That they're just taking the responsibilities of a government organization like FEMA or like the EPA, and there's no response from these federal programs to come to anyone's aid. And so they're talking about vinyl chloride. So in those 10 cars that were burned, they're talking about what is vinyl chloride, and they say this is from CBS News, by the way, so pretty mainstream, centrist, milk toast. The gas is used to make the polyvinyl chloride hard plastic resin in plastic products. So when you think of PVC pipe, that PVC polyvinyl chloride. Vinyl chloride is the intermediate substance used to make those other hard plastics. They go into all sorts of construction, especially of houses. And is it dangerous? Vinyl chloride is associated with increased risk of liver cancer and other cancers, according to federal government's National Cancer Institute. Oh, scary! Gotta throw out the cancer warning here. So that's already a big red flag to scare people. The effect was studied in PVC pipe makers who breathed in vinyl chloride and developed rare liver cancers. If you worked longer, you had higher risk. Vinyl chloride is dozens of times less toxic per molecule than DDT, but more dangerous than ammonia and natural gas. What happens when it burns? So, like, oh man, this is what we're dealing with, and that was the substance that the crew of the train burned. What happens when it burns? Because you think cancer, oh, now that stuff is in the air. What happens when it burns? Officials warned the controlled burn officials. Who are these officials? Who are these officials that these mainstream milk toast media, no critical thinking, just mouthpieces for unnamed officials in the EPA and the the Environmental Protection Agency and FEMA, these unnamed officials who weren't even there to assist in evacuating the community. Get rid of this advertisement. But unnamed officials weren't even present in evacuating the community or aiding in the destruction, the decomposition of these dangerous materials, and yet they get to be the ones who interpret this disaster. So that should already be a red flag for you, that the ones who are giving out the ones who are doing the fear mongering had no part in recovering the site or the community. That should tell you a lot. Officials warned the controlled burn would send phosgene and hydrochloride into the air. Phosgene is a highly toxic colorless gas with a strong odor that can cause vomiting and breathing trouble, and was used as a weapon in World War I. Ooh, ah, ah, ooh, ah, ah. Once you get over the fear of the World War I toxic gas in the air, okay, calm down. We're going to get through it, I promise you. Phosgene is considered safe at 0.1 parts per million during an 8-hour exposure. 8-hour exposure threshold would have been even lower when measuring inside people's homes. Hydrogen chloride is a colorless to yellowish gas with a strong odor, and primary effect on humans is skin, eye, nose, throat irritation. It is considered safe at 5 parts per million for an 8-hour exposure. So these are the chemicals that. So once you burn vinyl chloride, we're no longer monitoring vinyl chloride, because all of the cargo that was that chemical is just burned. It was turned into this black smoke, which is, other than the regular contents of smoke, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, things that you typically find in any kind of smoke, the more toxic and harmful elements were those other gases: hydrogen chloride, and phosgene. And this is what they were monitoring. And this is where this chemical fear, you see people online, especially in the region, like, are we still bringing the stuff in? Like, oh my God, all the stuff is in the water now. Like, all of these chemicals in the water are killing off fish. Like, if you look in the rivers, there's dead frogs and fish just floating downriver. Oh my God, we're drinking this stuff. And it's creating this feedback loop of panic. These officials who were not even at the scene creating this feedback loop of panic. But after doing some digging on Twitter, and this is why you should follow my Telegram, is getting a background of what these chemicals actually, of how they function. Like, they're not these super. There's not going to be super toxins that just exist forever, like mercury in the soil, or like dioxins when you burn styrofoam. That's what the media is making this stuff out to be, and allowing the general public to panic. Just so getting these actually informed opinions on Telegram. And I'm reading here from my own Telegram channel, so you should follow along if you want the text, because I'm not going to be sharing my Telegram on screen. But so ignition was inevitable. And again, the crew, the people driving the trains, were the one who made the decision to burn this cargo. They were specifically trained in the chemical properties of the stuff they were transporting. which just goes to show. Let's take a second to give a major shout out to the men who are just running the U.S. transportation system, the shit show that is the U.S. transportation system right now. Because on top of having to operate this heavy equipment, and on top of like transporting these dangerous chemicals, have to know how to dispose of these chemicals in the event of a disaster that they themselves saw coming. So just take a minute to really appreciate the working class people who are just allowing like carrying this country on their back, allowing it to function when they don't have to. So an ignition was inevitable. Uh, Chem Bros on Telegram writes, uh, surely you'd consider it better to destroy 40 to 50 meters radius of wildlife directly through through phosgene and through uh, hydrogen chloride, and accept incidental loss in a larger radius from wind-water movements than to leave the contaminant lingering in an unchanged form to cause chronic damage. So like hydrochloric acid, basically, which is what hydrogen chloride turns to when it touches water, so stomach acid, basically, and phosgene, which disappears after a couple of seconds when touched with air. So the immediate danger of this giant black cloud, rather than like affecting states just 1,000 miles away, it's really just going to affect the immediate radius of literally just the first few hundred feet around this burn zone, rather than leaving this highly explosive, highly carcinogenic fluid just sitting in a train car. And then other implications of the burn. Burning So first of all, burning vinyl chloride means that there's no more vinyl chloride, no more carcinogenic element to disperse into the air. It's burned. It's turned into a different chemical. And hydrochloric acid, basically stomach acid, is what is the majority of the content left. Phosgene doesn't interact with water. It just dissolves. It just breaks down very quickly. Hydrochloric hydrogen chloride, when coming into contact with water, turns into hydrochloric acid. And when you introduce like this acidic water to the water table, first of all, like just in the clouds and then into the ecosystem around the area of the burn, so whenever it rains, is going to increase the acidity of the water. So when you see these images of fish dying and frogs dying and all this wildlife and plant life is dying in the area, it's apocalyptic imagery. It's what we think of when we think of like the plagues of the Pharaoh from the Bible. But aquatic life is notoriously fragile for minor ecosystem change. I mean, this isn't minor, but through ecosystem changes like acidity of the water. But really, it's nothing. It's nothing that's going to be like Chernobyl. Literally, that was the comparison that people were making on Twitter, and that's amazing that they're conflating the radioactive substances that were dispersed over 100-mile radius or more that made the Chernobyl unlivable for decades, still radioactive. Comparing Chernobyl to East Palestine, Ohio, that's already like a mischaracterization and purposefully made to cause panic. It's just not true. It's not the surrounding environment will have water that's about as acidic as a can of soda for a couple of weeks, but it's not radioactive. It's not this cancer-causing nightmare that Chernobyl was. That is already a mischaracterization. The contents of the train were burned, and these World War I era gases coming out of the plume of smoke are only an immediate risk if you were 100 feet from this black column of deadly smoke, and any lingering effects just will be evaporated after a couple of days. And this is something you can look into through a very cursory glance on googling this information. Um, yeah, these chemicals do not accumulate in plants or animals like the radioactive material in Chernobyl does. Um, it's going to be evaporated before it ever reaches the groundwater, and so this Ohio spill is an issue. It is an issue, but the issue is not a chemical apocalypse, like social media is telling you. It's not. Um, it's not this like a lifetime of cancer risk forever. Um, it, it's economic, and this is the point that I wanted to make before I sign off. Um, in the same way that the major disaster of the 2020 pandemic, when it came to the United States, was not the virus itself. I don't want to use specific language that's going to get me flagged and blacklisted and all that, but we all know what I'm talking about here. The major consequences was not the less than 1% death rate. Um, it was the realization that U.S. hospitals did not have the capacity to deal with a huge uptick in sickness of people flooding the system. There was no stockpile of any of the necessary equipment that these hospitals were legally required to stock up on. Less than 5% of PPE, personal protective equipment. That it came to light that all of this equipment that was supposed to be stockpiled was being sold and the money being pocketed by board members of these hospitals. That was the real emergency. This was the real disaster that was exposed after the pandemic. And this is a similar situation. The real disaster here is that our public infrastructure, our public and private infrastructure, specifically the transportation system used to keep the vital materials of the economy moving and flowing so that we can build houses, so that we can continue having agriculture, so that we continue moving petroleum around, is breaking down. This is not the next Chernobyl. This is the next Suez Canal boat crash. Remember in 2021, the Evergreen tanker that crashed in the Suez Canal? This is a train equivalent of that. It's not chemical, it's economic. Norfolk Southern, the company that owns this train, took a calculated risk in starving the rail lines of essential rail workers to safely transport these dangerous materials. We know that this was a problem when the rail workers went on strike last year, and when Joe Biden passed historic legislation attacking their labor rights, attacking national labor rights for these people to get just basic sick days. Just sick days they're not even allowed to have. And so there's overworked, underpaid, they're at capacity to transport these huge trains carrying tons of cargoes across dilapidated infrastructure. These employees are telling the board members of Norfolk Southern that these sorts of crashes are inevitable. Just like the people who were driving these cargo ships, and who operate the daily flow of traffic through the Suez Canal, knew that a crash was going to happen on the scale of the Evergreen that crashed in the Suez Canal and caused a backlog, this block of traffic that we're still experiencing. Boats are still congested in ports around the world because of this block in traffic that the pandemic exposed and produced. This, and Norfolk Southern doesn't just like transport agricultural goods, but it also transports fuel. It also transports building equipment. This means that the same sort of huge spike in inflation that we're seeing with eggs, that eggs are now doubling, tripling in price because one generation of chickens had to be put down because of avian bird flu. We're going to see this for the next year, for building materials, for houses, for agricultural products. The other crashes that were happening, a truck in Arizona, it's this similar sort of media tactic um, is being used to shift focus away from the economic implications of these crashes and the crumbling infrastructure, and more towards these apocalyptic visions of suffocating to death on mustard gas. And let me share my screen here so I can give you another example. Share screen. Yeah, so this is the other crash that happened, and this time in Arizona. Shelter-in-place order reinstated after Tucson interstate crash. Again, we have this nightmare image of an orange cloud passing over the Arizona interstate, and the government saying to putting in like a shelter-in-place risk, without informing people of why this is happening, what the implications are, not evacuating enough people fast enough. And then because in Ohio, we saw like these really sad images of people's pets just suffocating to death because they weren't informed fast enough to get their pets inside. And so they're worried that like, are my children going to suffocate to death in the same way that my pets did? There's just no information. It's this similar environment of panic that is being sown throughout the population on purpose. Mass panic to take our eyes off of the fact that the companies transporting these materials are not invested in public infrastructure to make sure that we can get the stuff we need to live, like food and shelter. The real disaster here is economic. Nitric acid, the stuff being transported in this truck, is used for fertilizer. Like America is a huge exporter of food. But after all of these mysterious fires burning down food processing plants, after an entire 30 million chickens or some obscene number, just an entire generation of chickens in American farms had to be killed because of a strain of avian bird flu, tripling the price of eggs. Just like this is part of that cycle of infrastructure decay that is reaching a boiling point. Like nitric acid, when coming into contact with air, turns into it's sheltering in place because you don't want to breathe. And the same reason you don't want to breathe car exhaust. This isn't mustard gas. This is the same kind of chemical gas that you would see when you burn gasoline or any kind of fuel. Like if a similar, there's shelter in place rules when cities like Los Angeles or New Delhi have a bad enough smog problem. When air isn't circulating enough through a city and smog accumulates, there's shelter in place rules that are similar to this. And that's what this is. But they're making it seem like it's this Chernobylization of cities, which just aids in the decay of infrastructure that allows our food to grow, that allows houses to get built. This isn't an apocalypse. This is misdirection. Norfolk Southern made $3.2 billion last year. The company behind the train crash in Ohio made $3.2 billion. Part of the reason they made so much money, just like hospitals pocketing the money from selling equipment that they were supposed to be saving for pandemic scenarios, Norfolk Southern is pocketing money that they should have been using to hire more rail workers, to alleviate the pressures on rail workers, to update infrastructure so that trains don't fly off the tracks. And so they pocket this money rather than redistributing it to the working class that is keeping this country afloat. And that is the real emergency. Just aiding this deindustrialization spiral of while the richest people in the country get richer, the disasters that are accumulating because of their negligence or outright malice will continue to get worse. But it is entirely preventable if we decide to take control of these industries, if we decide to take control of American labor and American labor power, if we decide that we are the ones who should be in control of these profits. Because to divest from American transportation, to divest from agriculture, to divest from manufacturing, to divest from all of these industries which transportation keeps alive means that life expectancy goes down. We don't produce enough food, which means population goes down. We don't produce enough petroleum, which means we can't even heat our homes or keep gas in our cars. Because the news wants to focus on panic scenarios, to sow panic in the population, they can control the outcome, which is they can continue to pocket the profits that they make rather than investing in infrastructure, which would prevent these kinds of things from happening. This is 100% preventable, but only when these institutions, when these industries are in control of the workers who keep them running. The workers for Norfolk Southern were warning board members that the crash was going to happen. Just like all of the hospital workers who were working 24 hours a day during the pandemic were telling people, who were being shut down by the media, were had to go on social media and risk their jobs, risk jail time, risk FBI SWAT raids to warn the people of the actual danger, which was medical supply shortages, triage of nurses being worked to the bone so that they were making highly preventable mistakes that could have been avoided if hospital board members, instead of pocketing the profits, were reinvesting in their infrastructure, hiring more doctors, more nurses, getting more equipment to the people, expanding the number of beds. This is the same thing, but with the food that we're supposed to be growing to feed people. This is going to be the same kind of scenario, only instead of not being able to find a hospital bed, of someone's grandma having to be airlifted to another city because her local hospital has no more capacity to hold people. This is going to be your ability to get basic food. Not just transporting it through trains, but your ability to grow it, like with this truck crash in Arizona. We are able to be a food exporter, but only if we have the ability to continue to grow food, which takes fertilizer, which takes nitric acid to make fertilizer. This is the kind of panic which Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism, that allows not just the misdirection, but also the application of a new legal structure to pass legislation of banning harmful, banning quote unquote harmful substances. Like, why are we having to deal with chemical substances in the air and our water? Because we need them to grow food. When the panic gets bad enough, politicians and these officials, these unnamed, faceless spook officials, are going to be the ones who say we need to ban these dangerous chemicals, just like Biden did in Sri Lanka with synthetic fertilizer, creating a famine for the entire country. They want famine for the United States of America. That is what panic affords them. It affords them our critical thinking so that we have no ability to stop this when it happens. So we need to take a deep breath and realize that we are not in an apocalypse. We are just in a labor shortage. We are not in the next Chernobyl. All we need to do is take control of industry like we were always meant to do. And this stream has gone on long enough, but hopefully my message gets across. I will, if I do get any updated information about these ongoing crashes, I will continue to report on them. For now, I will be checking out. Make sure to like and subscribe for more content. My name is Teray. You're watching Hard Targets. That's all I got. I'm out.